Greetings, everyone on the call. It is now 1 p.m. PST, so we're going to start this module. This is Module 6, and we will be covering SQL Server in Azure CSP. Before I kick it over to Mike Patch, who will be presenting this module, I wanted to make attendees aware that please feel free to IM your questions during the presentation. I will repeat them and have them answered during the Q&A. And then for the last about 10-15 minutes of this hour, we'll open it up and I'll unmute the audience. Okay, so with that, I will kick it off to Mike.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Patch. I am a data platform specialist with Microsoft. I'm going to talk to you today about SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine. So getting right into it, if we look at the way that we can consume SQL Server today, you have some distinct possibilities. One of them is being on physical hardware. So you can install SQL Server right on the physical hardware, as happens quite frequently. Doing that, you have the high cost of the hardware and the maintenance of the hardware, and you have complete control over that instance. Another option is virtual, so a private cloud, virtualizing it, where you control the host and you virtualize the instance itself. So as we move more to the right, the control of that goes down, and as we move more to the right as well and up, the cost, the shared cost, goes down as well. So the focus of the conversation today will be infrastructure as a service, or SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machines. We also offer a platform as a service. So we have Azure SQL Database, and we'll talk about the differences of why you would want to choose one or the other. And at the very top, where you have very little control, but very little maintenance is involved, you have Office 365 for software as a service. So moving right into our discussion about the two. So why would you want to use SQL Server in Azure VM versus Azure SQL Database? Well, SQL Server in Azure VM, you would want to use that when you need a specific version of Windows and a specific version of SQL Server. You're free to put whatever version you want on there that you have adequate licensing for. And adequate software. You also would want to use that when you need instance level features like replication, agent jobs, link servers, DTC, things along those lines. And you use that when you're okay configuring and managing SQL Server in Windows on your own. So you're responsible for managing the patching, high availability, and backup. It's really great for migrating existing applications to it. Now, contrast, you have Azure SQL Database, which is platform as a service. You want to use this when you don't really need a specific version of SQL Server or Windows. Azure SQL Database is constantly updated to the current version. You would use it when you don't need instance level SQL features and you don't want to have to manage or configure SQL Server or Windows. It's great for new apps or new developments that don't require you to have to configure certain things within SQL Server. Continuing on that discussion, in SQL Server and Azure VM, you access the VM with SQL installed on it. And as I mentioned, you're able to install whatever version of SQL Server you would like to. You manage SQL Server in Windows on your own. You select the SQL Server and Windows version. In addition, we offer many different sizes, and we'll go over some of those today, and I'll show you in our demo how to set this up. Really simple and easy. And virtual machine availability is set at 99.95%. There is no SLA for SQL on top of that or any services that run on top of that virtual machine. Contrastly, in Azure SQL Database, you get a database. You get access to a single database. It's fully managed, everything from integrity to backups, fault tolerance, high availability. It's all managed on the back end. You don't have to worry about any of that. It will always run the latest version of SQL Server with Enterprise Edition, and we offer different sizes there. So basic tier is 2 GB database size with 5 transactions per second for throughput, to a premium tier of up to 1 terabyte for a single database with 1,750 transactions per second. The availability of Azure SQL Database from a service perspective is 99.99%. That equates to roughly a very small amount of downtime in a month. So I believe it's less than 4 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Right. Now that we understand the difference between those two, not only I will go into the topic of our discussion today, SQL Server on an Azure VM from an infrastructure as a service perspective. So a VM hosted in Microsoft Azure infrastructure, uh, you're able to create from your own images or from the Microsoft images all current supportable versions of SQL Server. And you can use Web Standard Enterprise or Express. They are refreshed every 3 months with the latest cumulative updates and hot fixes. So when you deploy one, you can be reasonably certain that it's not going to spend a lot of time updating as we keep those patches up to date. A deployment takes right around 10-15 minutes in that time frame, depending on what you're deploying. You can connect to it externally. We'll go through the connection mediums here, but you can connect to it through the internet, remote desktop. You can connect to it through a site-to-site VPN using various hardware. Also, you can manage it via the portal, the Azure portal, and I will show you that a little bit later in our discussion today using PowerShell or CLI. One of the advantages of Azure VM, one of the reasons why you would want to use it, because it's pay per use. So when that server is up and running, you're paying for the processing that it's consuming in the space that it's consuming. And that cost per month is going to depend on the size and the licensing. So if your application is seasonal and you want to have more capacity during a certain time of the year, like for example, during Black Friday time, retailers typically want to have more bandwidth and throughput. You can scale up your system at that time, and then when you're done with it, scale it back down. It can offer you some significant or cost savings in doing so. Like I mentioned, you only pay for when it's up and running. And for the network perspective, you only pay for outgoing, not incoming. The storage is allocated. You have two different types of storage, and we'll get into a little bit more details about the storage in a few minutes. But like I mentioned, it's elastic. You can scale it up and scale it down as you see fit. So security, when you look at Azure Virtual Machine security, you have your many different layers involved. You have your physical security, where the data centers are monitored all the time. There's always somebody there taking care of your valuable data, but our employees don't have physical access to it, so they can't put hands on customer storage. Then on top of that, you have infrastructure security, which is provided by virtual networks. The deployments are isolated in their own private networks, or like I mentioned before, you can use the site-to-site VPNs for security from that point of view. Also, at Azure storage, so the disks that are presented to your virtual machines exist in the blob storage. The storage accounts that support those are authenticated using strong keys, and you can store those keys in the Azure Key Vault. A lot of our customers are really interested in the various certifications that are out there for data. So HIPAA is one we get asked about a lot. Cloud Security Alliance and SOC 2. As you can see, there's a short list there. If you want to see a comprehensive list of every certification we have, I advise you to visit the Azure Trust Center compliance site. There's a URL there, and we can distribute that after the presentation if you're interested. Now, layering on top of the infrastructure, the physical security is the SQL security. So we offer encryption of connections, the encryption of the database, and the backups. And SQL Server will integrate with the Azure Key Vault to maintain your master keys as well. And SQL Server offers Active Directory authentication and SQL Server authentication. So you'll make SQL Server logins right within your instance when you set up the VM, and you can manage those as you would any normal SQL Server instance. Also, new with 2016, which just launched this week on June 1st, hooray! SQL Server features we offer always encrypted. So your data is now encrypted at rest and in flight. So it's decrypted at the client using the SQL Server driver. So we also offer with SQL Server 2016 row-level security and enhanced auditing and dynamic data masking. Really, we're there to make sure that only the people that need to see your data are going to see your data. The connectivity to your Azure VM, as we mentioned, it's really simple to set up. It's restricted. You can use it over public endpoints, so you can go right through the internet. You configure it through the firewalls that are set up within your Azure VM. And I'll show you that a little bit later. You can restrict it to certain source IP addresses and subnets, or as I mentioned a few times, over a site-to-site VPN tunnel. So that's also secured and encrypted using a VPN device or Windows Server routing service. We had mentioned a few times about the storage. Every disk that's presented to an Azure VM is a page blob in Azure Storage. And what that gives you is 3 local copies that's monitored by Quorum of the data. So we guarantee no data loss should a failure occur. That failure and disk decommissioning is done transparently. You're not going to see it. So something that's also available to you if you choose standard disk tiers is asynchronous, 3 more asynchronous remote copies using geosynchronous replication. So you can set that up when you set up your storage. So let's assume a tragedy occurs and something wipes out our data center in Texas and all your data's there. If you have a geosynchronous replication set up, your data would be in a different region as well. So failover would occur manually by Microsoft employees at that point. But let's just hope that Texas doesn't get wiped out. I would not be happy with that. So, like I said, geosynchronous replication gives you 3 more asynchronous copies in a different geographic location. Continuing on the VM storage, so as I mentioned, we have 2 different types of storage that you're allowed to set up when you set up a VM using your storage account. You've got standard storage. Really think of standard storage as your moving parts hard drives. So you still have your spindles and your disks spinning. Uses like I mentioned, hard disk drives, a max of 500 IOPS or 60 megs per second per disk. Varying latency, 20 milliseconds to 60 milliseconds, and the difference here is it's billed by used size. So if you allocate a terabyte of data in standard storage and you only use 500 meg, you're only paying for 500 meg. Now, the difference here is premium storage. Consider premium storage to be solid state drives. It also allows you to use a local readable solid-state drive as a read cache. And we'll get into how large those read caches are in the future and what kind of performance improvements it gives you. But premium storage is what we recommend for our SQL Server virtual machines. There's a max of 5,000 IOPS, or about 200 megabytes per second per disk, and you can stripe those for increased throughput. And they're relatively low latency, about 4 milliseconds, 1 millisecond reads from cache. And the difference in billing is it's billed by provision size. So really, when you're setting this up, you want to make sure you set the size to something that's relevant to your application, as you're billed by the provision size, not size used. So if you provision a terabyte of data, you're paying for a terabyte of disk space. Now, SQL Server offers you a feature of writing your MDF and your LDF files right to blob storage. So you don't have to do it on a virtual disk. Now, a question I've gotten quite often is it faster to write your database disk files right to the blob storage rather than going to a disk presented to a Hyper-V host? And as typical with questions like this, the answer is it depends. So if you're writing right to a disk and your intent is to have really fast writes, you're going to want to write that right to the blob. Writing right to a blob file gives you 15% increased speed in writes. Now, if you want increased speed in reads, the difference is you cannot take advantage of the caching from premium disk if you're writing right to a blob file. So the caching gives you significantly faster writes. So a little bit about the Azure VM series and storage. So we have 3 different series of servers. We got the A, D, and the G. And you can see from a dev test perspective, those particular servers are only supported using standard storage only. So a little bit slower CPU, a little bit more memory. Memory varies across the board. From production point of view, we have DS and GS series servers available to you, both able to use premium or standard storage, and they both leverage the read cache. If we take a look at some of the specs we have here, what we usually recommend for SQL Server is the DS12 or the DS13. If you look at the cache size there, 144 gigabytes of available local cache or 288 gigabytes That's a lot of cache. A lot of our customers could put their entire databases in cache size and, and experience significant re-improvement across the board using that. If you look at your max IOPS, you get a max of 25,600 there for what we recommend. Now, if you have that really, really gargantuan system that really needs some much higher end specs, we can accommodate that too with our GS series. If you look at our GS5, it's 32 cores, 48 gigabytes of memory, and 4,600 gigabytes of cache space, 80,000 IOPS. That is just a beast. So if you have requirements that are that high, we can accommodate, and Microsoft SQL Server on Azure VM can accommodate that. Something that comes up often when you're talking about these is the availability of the virtual machine. So the virtual machine is, we guarantee that there's no storage loss just by the copies on the blob storage. But the Azure Fabric for a single Azure virtual machine that's not in an availability set, the Azure Fabric will fail that over should you have a host failure. It'll fail it over. It encompasses about 12 minutes of downtime. So Azure patches on the virtual machine, we do them once a month. That encompasses about 10 minutes of downtime. So your 99.95, that's 10 minutes of it is the patching. You would be responsible on the virtual machine for anything patching on the OS level or the SQL Server level. So as we release new hotfixes or patches, those are your responsibility to manage. And Azure does not detect failures inside of a virtual machine. So you're going to want something that's monitoring SQL Server. I can show you how to use the Azure virtual machine monitoring from a system performance point of view. And you can set up alerts right within the Azure portal to do that for you. But if you want to use something like System Center, STOM, along those lines to monitor your SQL Server, you're encouraged to do so. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, there's something called an availability set. And think about this logically as two different racks. So you would take your host, and you would have each host in a different rack. And we allow you to do this in the Azure Virtual Machine using a product called the availability set. The virtual machines are not impacted by the same time when there's a rack or host failure, or you're doing a Azure host upgrade, which does occur. Once it's in the availability set, the one of two VMs in the availability set, we do the upgrades from one to the other and do the failover. As you can see, for 99.95% SLA, it's about 22 minutes of downtime per month, and that encompasses both. That time where it's down, we use that for the planned downtime due to host OS patching, or unplanned downtime due to physical failures. I'd like to say nothing ever fails physically, but I'm in my 40s now, that happens. So again, this does not include servicing of guest operating systems or software inside. So SQL Server patching, hot fixes, things along those lines are your responsibility. If 99.95 availability is not good enough for a customer, we offer the high availability on top of that through SQL Server. Using the high availability functions in SQL Server, you can reach 99.99 or less than 4 minutes of downtime per month. If a VM becomes unavailable, fail over to another one, less than 15 seconds. And it can detect SQL instance failures. Some of the options, actually one more thing to mention there. When you configure SQL Server always on replicas in the Azure Virtual Machine, you're going to want to make sure that those are in the same availability set. In fact, I believe it's a requirement. Some options you have for SQL Server high availability listed here. You've got your always-on availability groups. So you've got always-on availability groups basic and database mirroring. I'll walk through these briefly. So you have your availability groups in 2012, 2014, and 2016 in your Enterprise Edition. And new this year, to everybody's amazement, is allowing 2 replicas in Standard Edition of SQL Server 2016. That's right, we now offer 2 non-readable secondaries in Standard Edition, SQL Server 2016. You can get up to 9 replicas in 2016 and 2014 for always-on availability groups on Enterprise Edition. We also do offer and support database mirroring, but that functionality is deprecated, so we don't recommend that you do it. It may not be in future releases. So We recommend that you stick with always-on availability groups and either the basic or the enterprise level. All of this is automated. So you have automated configuration when you set up one of these, and we'll go through a lab in a few minutes here to show off some of that automation. The SQL Server connectivity, all automated for you when you set up the SQL Server. SQL Server performance best practices are set up within that image. You can set up automatic patching. So if you want to set up a automatic patching using Windows Update, you can set that up right within the configuration of the virtual machine. And we also offer database encryption and SQL Server always on. So we now have a template that will set up the entire always on cluster for you. So in the process of using that template, if you do not provide it a domain, it will create a primary domain controller and a secondary domain controller for you, as well as a file share witness in that cluster. Something interesting to note about SQL Server 2016, when you're adding new availability nodes to a cluster, it no longer requires you to be part of a domain. So you can have domainless nodes added to that always-on availability group. That's on top of Server 2016, which unfortunately is not launched yet. That is still yet to come. All right, moving right along. So we also offer SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine Monitoring. So I'll demonstrate this in a little bit, but you're able to add VM level monitoring from a performance perspective using the tools within the Azure portal, in the model of the Azure portal. So as I mentioned before, you can also use System Center for monitoring. And as noted here, it's not available at our competition currently. So with that, we kind of went through that relatively quickly. We'll have more time for Q&A, but we have an opportunity to set up a demonstration and show you some of that. So I will go ahead and set up and show you the Azure portal as it stands today. This is my Azure portal for my account. We'll go ahead and set up a SQL Server virtual machine right here for you. So your dashboard will show you any service instances that are happening. You look around, things seem relatively healthy. It looks like we have an informational going on there. Go right into Azure Virtual Machines if we want to create one. We have available to us a number of different templates. So to create a new virtual machine, simply select Add. And it'll bring up our templates available to us. So as you can see here, we have the SQL Server Always On Cluster virtual machine template that we can use. But for purposes of the demo today, we're just going to create a normal SQL Server. We select that template. It gives us the opportunity to choose different levels of SQL Server from a licensing perspective. So Enterprise, Standard, Web Edition, Express, and different editions of it. So if we take a look, I'm going to choose SQL Server 2016 RTM Enterprise on Windows Server 2012 RT. It's that simple. The next step is you choose a deployment model. For CSP, we will be using Resource Manager as a deployment model. Go ahead and hit Create. Really, we just fill in some basic information about the server and what we want to call it and things along those lines. So I'll fill that in. Let's call it SQL 2016 test for now. It's going to require you to put in a username and a password, and what this will be is a local user ID, a local administrator. We'll ask for your subscription, should be auto-filled in there as you already logged into your subscription. It will also ask you for a resource group. So what a resource group is a container for all resources that are utilized by this virtual machine. So everything that you want to put in there, you can also add other virtual machines to one. So as you can see, it gives me the opportunity to pick an existing resource group if I want to. I'm going to create a new one for purposes of this demo. So it allows us to choose a location for where we want this virtual machine to be, what region we would want it to be in. Seeing that I'm in South Texas, I'm just going to pick South Central US. Sounds good. And hit OK. Brings up the size of the machine that we want to pick. As we mentioned before, we have the DS and the GS for your production and your virtual machines. So it's your production and your test. So if I hit view all, we're able to look at all of the virtual machines available to us. We have quite a view, quite a bit here. As you remember, the DS ones are capable of doing premium storage, and the ones that are not DS or GS are not. So for purposes of our test, I'm just going to pick this one here, and it'll give you a cost estimated per month of what that would be. Pick 8 cores, 56 gigabytes of RAM, and yes, I will decommission this when I'm not using it. I don't want to pay for it, so definitely I will select this size. Now we get to go in and take a look at the server settings, so server level. Here we get to choose between premium and standard disk. I'm actually going to choose standard so I can show you something else with this. Then you select your storage account. Right now it's going to create a new storage account. You can select in the storage account configuration what type of disk and what type of redundancy you want. So right now it's just going to, you can name it whatever you like, but it's going to name it that. I'm going to change it from locally redundant storage to geosynchronous, or at least show you the area where you can do that. So you have different availabilities for the storage here that you're able to select. So I'm just going to leave it as local redundant storage. I just wanted to show you that section quickly. Hit OK, and we're all set there. Next option is the virtual network. So you can set up your virtual network any way you feel necessary and choose to. Looking in here, you have your address space. You can name the virtual network whatever you'd like and set up your subnets as you see fit for your security. It defaults to this. I'm going to leave it as default for purposes of this test today. So it'll create this test VM group for me. You can also set up different subnets and how they communicate. Also, your public IP address, something you want to take note of here when you're setting up your public IP address for external use. You can set it as dynamic or static. So a lot of folks like to set it as static so they don't have to change some of the other routes as you configure them. I'm just going to leave it as dynamic today. And your network security group, that is your Azure firewall. So this is going to contain your inbound and outbound rules. As you see by default, it adds your RDP, so you can actually remote desktop to your server. You're able to get in and start using it any way you see fit. Also, when you set up a SQL Server template, once SQL Server is installed, it will auto add your firewall rule for inbound SQL. So you'll have port 1433 set up for inbound there. They'll do it for you. And I can show you that later as well. So we're going to leave the network security group the way it is. Extensions. Extensions are added on pieces of software that allow you to manage other parts of your server. So if you want to add the PowerShell, looks like I didn't pick it. Oh, sorry about that. Let me go back through that. Let's take a look at what extensions are available. So if you wanted to add PowerShell for scripting, you can do that, or malware detectors, things that are included here. This is where you would do it using a Windows extension. You also enable or disable monitoring, the diagnostics that I mentioned to you. I leave them enabled on the servers that I do. So if you're going to be using a diagnostic to set up alert to monitor your data, you're going to want to make sure that this is enabled. And that data is stored in a storage account. It automatically sets one up for you using defaults. And you can change that if you'd like to, or you can have all your VMs use the same storage account if you'd like to. Also, as I mentioned earlier, this is where you would set up your availability step. So if you want your host to be in different fault-tolerant domains, so your host would be in different racks, more or less, you would create a new one here and fill in the information involved for the availability step. I'm not going to create one today. That's it for the server level. Now, for the SQL Server level, you have some basic setup that you need to do. So first thing you do is you select your SQL Server connectivity. Do you want it private only within that virtual network, or do you want be able to connect to it from the internet. I'm going to pick the internet so I can connect to it from my desktop here. When you do that, it will set up the right Windows firewall settings on the server itself through port 1433. I also set up SQL Server authentication. This is where you enable that. It will automatically take your local administrator account that you entered in your basic settings earlier and add that here. So that'll be the same login and password. You're welcome to change it if you'd like to. You can change your storage configuration of what you would do on this server as far as how large it is. Apparently, I chose an instance that wasn't available on. You can also set up your automatic patching. So if you want automatic patching to occur at a certain time, this is where you would set that up. So also the same with automatic backup. It's not available in SQL Server 2016 yet. It will be in the future. Right now, it is only available in SQL Server 2014. And as I mentioned a few times, you can also integrate this with the Azure Key Vault. This is where you would set that up. So looking at where we're at with this, hit OK. We get a summary. And it just quickly eyeballing that. It looks good to me. We'll go ahead and set this virtual machine up. As you mentioned, as you see on my dashboard here, the deployment is heading off there. So while that's deploying, you can always check for progress of the deployment mechanism in the virtual machine by hitting your virtual machines and looking here after you refresh it. It'll take a few seconds before you'll see it here. It'll show up here as creating. While that's deploying, I can show you the monitoring section. So I've got a separate SQL server that I've set up previously that's already up and running. It's a healthy box. It doesn't do a lot because I don't do a lot with it. But if you want to look at the monitoring, this is where you would do it. You can go ahead and take a look at the metrics here. You're allowed, and you can add different things to the chart. So if I go ahead and edit the chart, you can look at the different performance metrics that are available to you. You can change the chart type from bar to graph and take a look at the different options available. So there's that. Also in here, you would have to add the SQL Server metrics to it. But this one, I already have them added to it. So you can add them to the chart and you can set up alerts. So if I wanted to set up an alert, you would do that here. So something that's very common in the SQL Server DBA is you would set up based on blocking. So let's go ahead and do that. You can go ahead and grab the metric. If you were to go down here, the SQL, where is it here? Block tasks. So go ahead. I would have it alert me if the block task is greater than a certain threshold. I would probably say 1. We don't want to have any blocking in our SQL Server, depending on the use of it. And you can set that period over time, and it will email the users that you add here when that condition occurs. Yeah. I'll go ahead and not save that right now as it's just a test. That being said, let's go back and take a look at our Azure virtual machines. And the one that we just pulled it to create, the SQL 2016 test, there it is. And you can see the status as it updates. Sooner or later, this page will update. It'll show you the creating, updating, along those lines. It'll probably say updating at this point. Sorry, it refreshed too quick. It said creating. I saw the flash there. Yep, it shows us creating, so it's still building that virtual machine. As I mentioned, it takes between 10 and 15 minutes to fully create one. Now that we've got a virtual machine out there, something that we need to talk about is how do you get data to it? That seems to be a hindrance for a lot of folks. So I'm going to show you from a SQL Server perspective how easy that is to do. So I'm going to bring up my enterprise, my SQL Server Management Studio, and show you my Enterprise Edition local SQL Server instance. Right now I have a database here. I've conveniently named it AdventureWorks On-Prem. So we have an on-prem database. The first step in trying to get that data or moving that data to a Azure virtual machine is we would want to back that database up to a cloud storage medium. So I've created the credentials on this instance to allow me to do that. I've created a backup script that will back this right up to the cloud. So I'll show you how that works. As you can see, we're backing up right to a URL. That URL references my cloud container on my cloud storage. I'll go ahead and execute that. It's going to back up that database. It takes anywhere from 5-10 seconds range to execute. Perfect. It actually took exactly 7 seconds. So look at that. Now that backup file is in cloud storage, and I can show you that. I can connect to my Azure storage that I've got set up here right within Management Studio. Connected right to my blob. I've got my account keys, as I mentioned earlier. They're stored, or the access to the blobs are stored right within the account keys. Going into the container, there's my backup file. So I've got a backup file sitting in Azure storage right now. The next step is connecting to our virtual machine. So I've got another virtual machine that's up and running already for purposes of this demonstration. I'll go ahead and connect to that. You can see by the URL there that this is my 2016 virtual machine, cloudapp.azure.com. So it's out there running. We do not have any databases attached to it today. So I will go ahead and execute a restore from URL statement. Take a look at the statement really quick. Restoring from my URL is coming right from that same blob container. Using my credential that I split up internally to use my Azure blob storage key, and it's moving the file to where I want it to move on that instant. So I'll go ahead and execute that. It takes roughly 5 seconds. Take this opportunity to talk a little bit. Now, generating these scripts is something that everyone wants to do. So you have an opportunity to use various different tools to do the same migration. You may have an opportunity with customers today where they have old versions of SQL Server 2005 on things that aren't supported any longer. SQL Server 2005 is sunsetted, as support has, as of April, I believe. And we offer support of a couple tools through our partners. So one of them is created by BitTitan. Another one is created by Tearaway. And you can use these tools to migrate data to and from instances of SQL Server that are local, or to and from SQL Server from bare metal to the cloud, or vice versa. If you're interested in pursuing any of those tools or would like more information on them, please reach out to either myself or my colleague Sarah Barella after this presentation, and we would be happy to set you up with a demonstration or show you a little bit more about those tools. So to show that this database has copied over, we can just go right to my SQL instance and refresh the database list, and there it is. So we have successfully moved an AdventureWorks database from an on-prem instance to a SQL Server Azure virtual machine. That concludes the demonstration from that point of view. So going back and looking at the portal, we can take a look at where the VM is that we were doing. As you can see, it's updating. So it's in the process of being built right now. And in a few minutes, it'll be complete and ready to use. Connecting to these VMs is really simple. If you want to connect using RDP, simply right-click on it and select Connect. It opens up a remote desktop portal. That concludes the demonstration today and the presentation. So without further ado, we can move on to the QA section.
All right, thanks, Mike. So first, I received two IM questions, so I will go through those first, and then I'll unmute the audience for anyone who actually wants to speak and ask a question to Mike. So the first question is from Raj. Does domainless server require Win 2016? For example, SQL 2016 with Win 2012 R2?
No, it does require you to have Windows Server 2016. So that, like I mentioned, that has not launched yet.
Okay. And then the second question was from David Hill. When updating host for IaaS and then rebooting these hosts, are the VMs being live migrated to another host, or are they being shut down and powered back on another host?
I believe they're being live migrated. Maybe Andrew Cook could help us with that answer if he knows.
If you're just rebooting a VM, you're going to stay on the same host. If you turn a VM off and it's deallocated, then you turn it back on, you're not likely going to be on the same host. If Microsoft's performing maintenance, then we're going to evict you from that host and put you on another one. You can choose to not have that happen to you by using the Redeploy Me Now button in the Azure portal, which will essentially reboot you onto a patched host at your convenience.
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, so I don't have any other IM questions. I have unmuted the audience. So if anyone has any questions for Mike, please feel free to ask, or any other clarifying questions. I see David asked a clarifying one via IM. So he says, I guess I am asking, should I expect my VM to be shut down every month?
No, no. Microsoft performs maintenance at specific intervals. You're notified, depending on the maintenance, 30, 60 days ahead of time that maintenance is going to occur. And if you have a Premier agreement, you have even further notification. If you do nothing, then during that maintenance window, let's say it's a Saturday, your VM will have a service interruption as it's taken down, as it's shut down and restarted on another patched host. If that maintenance window and not knowing at what point throughout that day your VM is going to be impacted by that isn't acceptable, you can go into the Azure portal between the day you receive notification of the impending maintenance and the day of maintenance, and you can click a Redeploy Me Now button on that VM that will perform that maintenance at that time, moving your VM from the host that has to be patched to a host that is already patched. Is it once a month? It just depends on what Microsoft is doing. And I'll tell you that Microsoft's goal is to have Azure to the point that we can patch the underlying infrastructure, because this is not patching your host's OS. This is patching the underlying Azure infrastructure. Our goal is to have that process to the point that we can swap the kernel out of the underlying host, and it'll be accomplished in less time than it would take for the TCP packets to time out. So you would never even have a reboot. You would never even know it's happening. That's our goal. It is not live migrated.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question if nobody else.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is kind of specific to something I've been running into, but basically you had mentioned deploying a SQL image using those gallery images,
Yeah,
and they're set per edition, right? Like
Yeah.
Enterprise, Web, Standard.
correct.
And so the customer I'm working with is trying to change editions, but it seems that when you use those gallery images, are you locked in to that edition?
You are not. I've been able to change editions myself. Did it just recently. I haven't seen any issues in doing that. As long as you have accurate license and accurate install to do that.
Okay. And so the other part of that is, can you then apply one of your on-premise licenses over that gallery image?
You cannot do it over. It will not let you do that. There's a different template that you have to use to bring your own license to it.
Okay, so you have to make that decision before.
Correct.
Okay, bummer. Thanks.
Awesome. Any other questions?
SQL's such a hot topic, Mike. I think you wowed them with the demo. Not sure.
Well,
Or
I
they
think I
just came
covered
back
it.
from lunch.
That could be too. Awesome. All right. If anyone has any further questions that you think of later, feel free to email me. I think I saw my email fly by there. If not, I'll put it in the window again. Also, if you want to talk about the BitTitan migration tool or the Tearaway migration tool, I'd be happy to go into depth on either with you, and we can talk about maybe helping your customers with that. So feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help out. With that, I think we're done, Amma.
Yes, can you go to the next slide if there's
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Let me pull that up real quick.
okay.
Uh,
And then myself and Mike will just kind of hang on for maybe the next 5 minutes if maybe um, someone is shy and want to ask a question later on or it pops into your head. Um, the next module is hybrid infrastructure as a service, which starts at 2 p.m. The link and conference ID is on the screen, and I've also IM'd it as well. So with that, I will officially close and stop the recording. But myself and Mike will just stay on if there's any last minute questions from anyone on the line.